Shame is the silent saboteur of potential. It is not always loud, but it is always present. It doesn't arrive with a shout, it whispers in moments of hesitation. It convinces people they are unworthy before they even begin. And that's what makes it powerful. Not its volume, but its ability to embed itself quietly in the heart of every decision, every dream, and every doubt. Most people misunderstand shame. They think it's just guilt in disguise. But shame isn't about what someone did, it's about who they believe they are. Guilt says, I made a mistake. Shame says, I am the mistake. It's not an acknowledgement of behavior, it's an indictment of identity. And when people listen to shame, they start to internalize this false identity as truth. Shame tells a story that no one else hears, yet it becomes the loudest narrative in the mind. It doesn't need an audience to humiliate. It doesn't need a critic to destroy self-worth. It thrives in isolation, in silence, in the quiet moments when a person questions if they are enough. And when left unchecked, shame becomes the lens through which they view the world and themselves. What makes shame especially dangerous is that it grows in secrecy. When it goes unnamed, it goes undefeated. People hide their failures, their imperfections, their wounds, believing they are alone in their struggle. But they are not alone. Everyone in some form has encountered that voice that says, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not lovable enough. That voice doesn't discriminate. It shows up for the strong, the successful, the kind, the ambitious. And it thrives where people pretend it doesn't exist. The greatest deception shame offers is convincing people to stay silent, to not ask for help, to not speak up, to not stand tall, because shame equates vulnerability with weakness. It makes people afraid of being seen, of being judged, of being found out. It creates a prison without bars, a psychological confinement that locks away confidence, creativity, and courage. But here's the truth that shame cannot stand. It loses power the moment it is exposed. The second it is named, it begins to weaken. When someone says, this is shame, they take the first step toward disarming it. Awareness is resistance, courage is defiance, and honesty is liberation. Listening to shame doesn't have to mean obeying it. To hear its voice does not mean surrendering to its lies. The difference between being controlled by shame and rising above it lies in one simple choice: to confront it instead of avoiding it. That choice changes everything. Everyone has a story shame tries to rewrite. It may twist past pain into permanent worthlessness. It may take a single failure and turn it into a lifelong identity. But shame is not the author of truth. It is the shadow of fear disguised as fact, and it can be rewritten. It must be rewritten. This is not about perfection. It is about reclaiming worth that was never truly lost, only covered. It's about realizing that the voice of shame isn't prophetic, it's parasitic. It feeds off insecurity and uncertainty, and it shrinks when confronted with courage and clarity. When people begin to listen more closely, they'll notice something profound. Shame's voice isn't their own. It was planted by criticism, comparison, trauma, rejection, and what was planted can be uprooted. What was absorbed can be released. What was believed can be redefined. So this is the beginning, the unveiling. The confrontation. This is the moment where shame's power starts to dissolve. Because when you listen to it consciously, you no longer react unconsciously. When you name it, you reclaim your power. And in doing so, you take the first step toward freedom, not from shame's presence, but from its control. Shame doesn't always show up in obvious ways. It often wears the mask of self-awareness. It pretends to be introspection, humility, or responsibility. But in truth, it is none of those things. Shame does not seek understanding. It seeks domination. It doesn't ask, what can I learn? It says, you should already know. It doesn't inspire growth, it paralyzes it. When people reflect on their past or analyze their behavior, there's a critical difference between growth and self-condemnation. Growth says, this is what happened, and this is how I'll rise from it. Shame says, this is what happened, and this is proof that I'm a failure. The words may sound similar on the surface, but their roots are miles apart. One builds a stronger foundation, the other erodes it from underneath. Shame speaks in extremes. It doesn't allow for context or nuance. It turns moments into identities. It convinces people that one rejection means they're unlovable, that one mistake makes them irredeemable, that one failure defines their future. It doesn't care about facts. It thrives on distortions, and unless it's identified and separated from self-awareness, it will continue to disguise itself as wisdom. But true self-awareness doesn't accuse, it informs, it reveals without wounding. It sheds light without burning down the room. It allows people to examine their actions without collapsing their sense of self. It holds space for imperfection without equating it to inadequacy, and that distinction changes everything. To listen to shame without recognizing its disguise is to invite an internal critic into every room, every decision, every moment of reflection. It's to question your value before you even understand the situation. It's to carry a weight that was never meant to be yours, and the worst part is that this critic doesn't shout. It whispers just enough to sound like your own voice, but there is a way forward. It begins with separation. It begins with identifying the voice of shame and holding it apart from the truth of who you are. It starts with saying, "This thought is not me. This judgment is not truth. This weight is not mine to carry." Because shame is not the teacher. It is the thief. It steals confidence, joy, connection, and clarity, and it does so by mimicking self-awareness until it is no longer questioned, but once questioned, once named, it begins to unravel. The next time you reflect on yourself, pause and ask, is this voice pushing me to grow or pulling me down? Is it pointing out an opportunity or pronouncing a sentence? Is it leading me toward light or trapping me in darkness? That moment of pause, that moment of discernment, is the beginning of reclaiming your power, because you were never meant to carry shame as truth. You were meant to walk with self-awareness as a guide, not bow to shame as a judge. Shame grows strongest in silence. It thrives in the spaces where truth is swallowed, where feelings are buried, where voices are muted. It doesn't require a crowd to gain power. It only needs the absence of expression. The more someone keeps it inside, the louder it echoes. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is pressure. Sometimes it's the heaviness of unspoken fears and hidden wounds. And when that silence is shaped by shame, it's not protective. It's imprisoning. What isn't spoken begins to define the self in destructive ways. Every suppressed truth becomes another brick in the wall between who someone is and who they are capable of becoming. The cost of silence isn't just emotional. It's also mental, physical, and relational. Shame held in silence distorts perception. It makes connection feel unsafe. It isolates, even when surrounded by others. It fuels anxiety, corrodes self-esteem, and keeps joy out of reach. It convinces people to hide parts of themselves that were never meant to be hidden, all in the name of avoiding judgment. But shame never asked for protection. It demanded obedience. It convinced people that if they spoke, they'd be rejected. If they were honest, they'd be ridiculed. If they exposed their truth, they'd lose their worth. So they kept quiet, not because they lacked courage, but because shame made them believe silence was survival. Yet the truth is, healing begins where silence ends. The act of speaking, even in the smallest way, is an act of rebellion against shame's hold. Expression is not weakness. Vulnerability is not exposure. Speaking truth is not inviting shame, it is evicting it. The fear of judgment may never fully disappear, but the fear of remaining silent must be greater. Because staying silent doesn't just protect others from seeing the pain. It protects shame from ever being challenged. When someone finds their voice, even trembling, they begin to shatter the illusion that they are alone. And in that moment, shame loses its grip, because shame wants silence, but healing demands sound. The invitation is simple but powerful. Speak. Speak when shame says to stay silent. Speak even when the words come slowly. Speak even when the voice shakes, because every word spoken in truth weakens the chains of shame. Every expression is a declaration. I will not be ruled by silence anymore. Perfectionism often appears noble. It wears the mask of high standards, ambition, and excellence. But beneath that polished exterior lies something much darker: shame. Perfectionism is not the pursuit of doing well. It is the fear of not being enough. It is not driven by the desire to succeed, but by the terror of failure, exposure, and judgment. Shame and perfectionism are deeply intertwined. Perfectionism says if I look perfect, live perfectly, perform perfectly, then I'll be safe from shame. But it's a lie, because no matter how flawless the image, shame still whispers, it's not good enough. You're not good enough, and so the cycle begins, chasing an impossible standard to outrun an internal voice that never stops moving the goalpost. Perfectionism doesn't lead to freedom, it leads to exhaustion. It creates a life of constant performance, where mistakes are catastrophes and imperfections are crimes. It convinces people that their value is measured only by what they achieve, how they appear, and what others think. There is no room for rest, for reflection, or for being real, only relentless pressure to maintain the illusion. Shame weaponizes perfectionism by turning effort into identity. It whispers, if you fail, you are a failure. If you fall short, you are worthless. If you make a mistake, you are broken. These messages don't motivate. They immobilize. They don't build resilience. They erode it. And eventually, they lead to paralysis. The fear of trying anything at all because the cost of getting it wrong feels unbearable. But the truth is, perfection is a moving target that no one ever hits. It is a trap disguised as a standard, and letting go of perfectionism is not about lowering expectations. It's about separating worth from performance. It's about saying, I am allowed to try, to grow, to stumble, and still be enough. Shame cannot survive where there is self-compassion. When someone says, I am more than my mistakes, perfectionism begins to crack. When they remind themselves that effort is not evidence of deficiency, but of courage, the illusion begins to dissolve, and in that space there is freedom. Freedom to be human, freedom to be honest. Freedom to show up not as perfect, but as whole. Letting go of perfectionism is not surrender, it is strength. It is the act of defying shame's most subtle weapon and choosing authenticity over approval. It's the decision to stop performing and start living. In the presence of shame, people build armor, emotional armor, behavioral armor, social armor. It is the instinctive reaction to a world that feels too critical, too unsafe, too harsh. But what begins as protection quickly becomes a prison. The very armor meant to defend ends up suffocating what's most real. This armor takes many forms: perfection, numbness, sarcasm, disconnection. Overachievement, withdrawal. People construct these barriers not because they're weak, but because at some point they believed they had to hide to survive. Shame told them the truth was too much, the real self too flawed, the vulnerability too dangerous. So they armored up. But here's what shame never tells. Armor is heavy. It doesn't just block pain, it blocks joy. It doesn't just hide flaws, it hides light. It keeps people safe, but it also keeps them small. Behind that armor, the world never gets to see who someone truly is, and eventually they begin to forget too. The greatest irony is this: the armor that is built to protect from judgment often invites more of it, because it creates distance, it creates silence, it creates a version of the self that is hard, guarded, and unreachable, and that distance becomes fertile ground for shame to grow, unchecked and unchallenged. The journey to healing doesn't require tearing the armor off in one swift motion. It starts with awareness. It starts with asking, what am I hiding behind? What am I afraid of being seen? What would happen if I let just a little light in? It begins with one choice: to loosen the grip on self, protection, and lean, even slightly, into truth. Removing the armor is not about exposing wounds to the world. It's about no longer pretending those wounds don't exist. It's about allowing real connection to replace hollow performance. It's about understanding that worth isn't earned through defense, it's revealed through courage. The armor may feel like safety, but it's the weight people were never meant to carry. And the moment they begin to release it, they rediscover the strength that was there all along. not the strength of hiding, but the strength of being seen. Shame has a singular fear exposure. It cannot survive in the light. It cannot hold its power when the truth is fully visible, and yet it convinces people that being seen is the ultimate danger. It twists the most basic human need, connection, into a perceived threat. It says, if they see the real you, they'll walk away. This fear is not just about being noticed. It's about being known, fully, deeply, authentically. Shame doesn't fear attention. It fears intimacy, because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is shame's undoing. To be known is to risk judgment, but it is also the path to belonging, and that is what shame tries hardest to prevent. It tells people to shrink, to hide behind masks of strength, humor, detachment, or perfection. It tells them to filter their personality, dilute their truth, and edit their existence. It warns if you reveal too much, you'll be rejected. If you open up, you'll be hurt, and so people play it safe. But safety becomes isolation, caution becomes loneliness, and what was once self-preservation becomes self-abandonment. The tragedy is that this fear of being seen denies people the very thing they crave most, connection. Because true connection doesn't happen at the surface. It doesn't happen through masks or carefully crafted identities. It happens in honesty, in presence, in imperfection. It requires someone to say, here I am. This is me, not perfect, not polished, but real. When people begin to confront this fear, they discover something shame never admits. Being seen does not equal being judged. In fact, more often than not, being seen invites compassion. It opens the door to empathy, understanding, and acceptance, because everyone carries something, and when one person dares to show up honestly, it gives others permission to do the same. There is power in saying, I am no longer hiding. There is freedom in declaring, I will not fear my own truth. That decision doesn't make shame disappear overnight, but it silences its dominance. It rewrites the script that says, I must perform to be loved, and replaces it with a new truth. I am worthy as I am. Being seen is not the risk shame claims it to be. It is the very act that begins to restore what shame has stolen. It is the path back to self, back to truth, back to wholeness. Shame rarely shouts. It whispers through an inner critic, a voice so familiar it's mistaken for truth. This voice doesn't just comment on actions, it attacks identity. It says, you're not good enough, you'll never be enough. Who do you think you are? It disguises itself as self-awareness, but its aim is not growth. Its goal is control. The inner critic is shame's most trusted messenger. It appears in moments of uncertainty, of risk, of reflection. It rewinds past mistakes and replays them with cruel commentary. It invents imaginary conversations and distorts memories. It doesn't seek understanding. It seeks punishment, and its weapon is repetition. Over time, that voice becomes internalized. It becomes the soundtrack of self-worth. And the more it speaks, the more power it gains. People start to believe they are their mistakes. They start to view every weakness as a verdict. Every setback becomes a reflection of who they are, not what they experience. But here's the truth, that voice is not you. It is not your intuition. It is not your higher self. It is a construct born from past wounds, unmet expectations, and learned self-rejection. It is not honest. It is not helpful. It is a distortion. The power of the inner critic lies not in its accuracy, but in its repetition. The more it speaks without challenge, the more it is believed, but belief does not equal truth. And challenging that voice is not arrogance, it is self-respect. Silencing the inner critic begins with identification, naming it, hearing it without obeying it, responding with clarity instead of agreement. When the voice says, you're not enough, the answer must be, that's not true, and you don't get to define me. When it says, everyone will judge you, the response must be, I refuse to judge myself first. This work is not about pretending shame doesn't exist. It's about refusing to give its voice the final say. It's about replacing the critic with compassion. It's about recognizing that the true voice of growth is gentle, honest, and patient, not harsh, shaming, and relentless. You are not your failures, you are not your fears, and you are certainly not the voice that tells you to stay small. That voice was built, not born, and anything that was built can be dismantled. Shame doesn't just affect the way people see themselves. It shapes the way they connect with others. It distorts how love is received, how trust is built, and how intimacy is experienced. When shame sits at the center of a person's identity, it infects every bond they try to create. It convinces them that if others truly knew them, they would walk away. It tells them to hide parts of themselves in relationships, not because they want to be deceptive, but because they believe they are unlovable as they are. So instead of showing up fully, they present versions of themselves they think will be accepted. And in doing so, they abandon their own truth. This creates a cycle of disconnection. Because even when someone is loved, if they're hiding behind shame, they'll never feel loved. They'll feel loved for the mask, not for the truth. And so they keep performing, keep suppressing, keep doubting. Trapped in relationships that look real but feel hollow. Shame also creates fear where there should be safety. It turns vulnerability into a threat. It makes honest communication feel dangerous. It causes people to withhold, to shut down, to distance themselves emotionally. Not because they don't care, but because they fear rejection too deeply. They think, if I open up, I'll be hurt. If I express my needs, I'll be seen as weak. If I ask for love, I'll look desperate. These beliefs come from shame, not reality. In this way, shame becomes the silent third party in every relationship. It sabotages closeness. It fuels jealousy, resentment, insecurity, and mistrust. And worst of all, it convinces people to accept less than they deserve, because they believe that's all they're worth. But healthy relationships are not built on fear or performance. They are built on truth, on mutual acceptance, and on the courage to be seen. That courage is the antidote to shame, because when someone shows up authentically and is still met with love, the lie of unworthiness begins to fall apart. Relationships thrive when honesty replaces perfection, when flaws are not hidden but held with care, when shame is named and no longer allowed to lead. When people stop performing and start connecting, something powerful happens. Shame begins to lose its place. The work begins within, but its impact is far-reaching. When you heal your relationship with yourself, you change the way you relate to everyone around you. Because shame cannot control someone who has learned they are already worthy of love. Comparison is one of shame's sharpest tools. It lures people into measuring their worth by someone else's highlights. It convinces them that their value is tied to how they rank, not who they are. And in that trap, shame doesn't need to invent new lies. It simply amplifies the feeling of inadequacy. The problem isn't admiration, it's distortion. Comparison doesn't show the full truth. It shows a curated version of others and convinces people to hold it against their raw, unfiltered reality. It says, look at their success, their beauty, their happiness. What's wrong with you? It takes someone's progress and turns it into proof of your failure. It takes someone's joy and turns it into your shame. But comparison isn't rooted in truth. It's rooted in scarcity. It assumes there isn't enough love, success, or worth to go around. It promotes the belief that if someone else is shining, it means you must be fading. And shame feeds on that scarcity. It whispers, you'll never catch up. You're already behind. You're not enough, and you never will be. That's the illusion that life is a race, that people are opponents, and that worth is something to earn by outshining others. But the reality is far different. Worth is not comparative. It is intrinsic. It cannot be upgraded by validation or downgraded by someone else's accomplishments. Comparison steals gratitude. It blinds people to their own growth, their quiet wins, their personal journey. It shifts the focus outward until the inner voice is drowned out by external measurements. But healing comes when that voice is reclaimed. When someone says, I will not define my value by someone else's chapter. I will not diminish my path to glorify another's. This doesn't mean avoiding ambition. It means honoring progress. It means choosing celebration over competition. It means looking inward and asking, am I growing? Am I becoming more true to myself? Because that is the only standard that matters. Shame loses power when comparison loses influence. And comparison loses influence when people stop chasing someone else's life and start living fully in their own. Shame is a storyteller. It weaves narratives about who people are, what they deserve, and what they should fear. It takes moments and turns them into definitions. It takes experiences and twists them into limitations. And for many, those stories become identity, not because they are true, but because they go unchallenged. This is how shame operates. It fills in the blanks with lies. When there's uncertainty, it provides an answer. You failed because you're not good enough. You were rejected because you're unlovable. You were hurt because you deserved it. It doesn't need evidence. It just needs repetition. Over time, these stories harden. They become beliefs, and those beliefs shape lives. But the truth is this. Just because shame told the story doesn't mean it's the final chapter. There is power in rewriting the narrative, in pausing long enough to ask, whose voice is this? Whose version of my life am I living? Because often, shame's story was inherited from past wounds, from others' expectations, from painful experiences that were never properly named or healed. And if it was inherited, it can be released. Reclaiming the narrative doesn't mean rewriting history. It means reclaiming authorship. It means recognizing that the pen was handed over to shame, and now it must be taken back. It's the act of separating fact from interpretation, event from identity, failure from worth. Every time a false narrative is replaced with truth, a piece of freedom returns. Every time someone challenges the internal script, they chip away at shame's control. It may not be easy. Shame resists change. But truth is persistent, and once it enters, it begins to clear the fog. Reclaiming the narrative is not about pretending nothing happened. It's about refusing to let the worst moments become the only story. It's about saying, this is not where it ends. I get to decide how I move forward, and moving forward doesn't require perfection. It requires presence, intention, courage, the willingness to write a new ending, not built on fear, but on truth. Not shaped by shame, but by resilience. Your story is not what happened to you. It is what you choose to do with what happened, and shame does not get to hold the pen. Shame survives on silence, secrecy, and fear. And there is one force that confronts all three: courage. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet, steady kind. The kind that whispers, I will show up anyway. The kind that says, I will not hide anymore. Courage is not the absence of shame. It's the refusal to let shame decide. It's the choice to keep going, to keep speaking, to keep showing up, even when that inner voice tries to hold you back. Shame says, you're not ready. You're not enough. You'll regret this. But courage answers, I'm doing it anyway. What makes courage powerful is not its boldness, but its honesty. It does not require confidence. It only requires willingness. Willingness to be vulnerable. Willingness to be real. Willingness to stand in truth even when fear is present. And that willingness begins to break shame's grip, one act at a time. Each courageous step, no matter how small, reclaims a piece of dignity. Telling the truth, asking for help, setting a boundary, owning a mistake without collapsing into self-hatred. These moments are not weakness. They are declarations of strength. They prove that shame does not get the final word. Courage also creates a ripple effect. When one person dares to be real, it gives others permission to do the same. It opens a path out of isolation. It reminds people that they're not alone, and shame, which thrives in disconnection, begins to weaken in the presence of shared humanity. But courage is a practice. It must be chosen again and again, because shame doesn't disappear in a single act. It retreats and resurfaces. It tests resolve. It waits for vulnerability. And each time it returns, courage must rise again. The invitation is not to be fearless. It is to be faithful to the truth, to keep choosing honesty over hiding, to keep stepping forward even when doubt follows close behind. Courage is not easy, but it is always worth it. Because shame cannot coexist with a heart that refuses to be silenced. And every time you choose courage, you reclaim what shame tried to steal: your voice, your worth, your freedom. Where shame demands judgment, self-compassion offers mercy. It doesn't excuse mistakes. It holds them gently. It doesn't deny pain. It sits with it without condemnation. And in a world where shame thrives on harshness, self-compassion is a radical act of healing. Shame teaches people to punish themselves. It insists that suffering is deserved, that imperfection must be corrected with self-criticism, that failure must be followed by self-abuse. But self-compassion breaks that cycle. It says, I can hold myself accountable without tearing myself down. I can be honest about my struggles without abandoning myself in them. This is not weakness. This is strength rooted in truth, because the truth is, every human being makes mistakes. Every soul has cracks, and shame wants those cracks to remain hidden, feared, and unspoken. But self-compassion looks at the cracks and says, this is where the light comes in. Self-compassion transforms the relationship with pain. Instead of hiding from it, people learn to meet it with kindness. Instead of using shame as a weapon, they use understanding as a guide. And in that shift, the inner voice begins to change. It softens. It nurtures. It becomes an ally instead of an enemy. This isn't about ignoring consequences or dismissing responsibility. It's about recognizing that punishment isn't the path to growth. Presence is. Kindness doesn't dilute transformation. It accelerates it. When people feel safe in their own skin, they become more resilient, not less. When they stop shaming themselves, they stop fearing failure, and that is where real change begins. To practice self-compassion is to reclaim the ground that shame has occupied for too long. It's to replace the inner critic with an inner caretaker, one who says, you're allowed to be learning, you're allowed to be healing, you are still worthy in your becoming. This is the power of grace. Not as an excuse, but as a declaration. I am not broken because I struggle. I am growing because I continue, and that growth, rooted in self-compassion, becomes the foundation of unshakable strength, a strength that no lie from shame can dismantle.